Let's get a bit of a reality check on that from Jean-François Perrault. He is Scotiabank's Senior Vice President and Chief Economist. Hi, Mr. Perrault. Good to have you on the program.
Nice to be here.
The Minister of Finance was asked today about the idea of who is responsible or what is responsible for reining in inflation. And our audience just heard her say that the primary responsibility rests for the central bank, with the central bank, rather. You feel like government could be playing a bigger role. That's my understanding from the paper you produced. Can you tell us why?
Well, I mean, she's right. I mean, the Bank of Canada is mandated to control inflation. So there's no question about that. And that is not, something that we question. Our premise is simply that inflation is so high right now that we wonder whether or not there could not be a better outcome in inflation control if the government and the Bank of Canada are working a little bit more closely together to achieve the 2% inflation target relative to how things were in over history, which was, when inflation is a little bit below or a little bit below, a little bit above the target, then of course Bank of Canada's got plenty of ability to do that. We're just dealing with really exceptional circumstances right now.
Yeah, I guess is that sort of the genesis of what you're saying, the fact that it isn't just maneuvering things a point here or a point there. We're talking about inflation, which is expected this week to be higher than 7%.
Exactly, right? I mean, in principle, the government and the Bank of Canada have this joint agreement to control inflation. And our sense is, with inflation close to 7%, the highest it's been since the Bank of Canada's targeted inflation, do we want to, give them a little bit of help to make sure that we do, in fact, manage to bring inflation down to the target that both they and the Bank of Canada have agreed is in the best interest of the country?
Help myself and our audience understand in layman's terms what that would mean for the government. Does it, for example, mean making cuts to current levels of spending?
It could. I mean, the idea simply is, if the government continues on the path that it's on, which is basically what governments around the world are doing, so there's nothing special about how we're doing things here, then the burden of adjustment falls on the Bank of Canada. So the Bank of Canada raises interest rates until inflation goes down to where it wants it to be, 2%. But that adjustment is occurring entirely on the back of the private sector, right? So the Bank of Canada raises interest rates, it makes it more expensive for you and I to borrow, we reduce our expenditures. The idea with a little bit more of a coordinated approach is if the government were to reduce its expenditures, let's say on wages and salaries, on goods and services, so government consumption in kind of the national accounts language, you'd have this ability to maybe lessen the burden of adjustment on the private sector because the government would be taking on some of that adjustment burden as well. So it's really about, how do we want the adjustment to occur? And do we want the government to maybe lessen some of the adjustment burden on the private sector by making it, by giving the Bank of Canada a bit of a chance to not raise interest rates as much as it otherwise would need to if we were basically to keep on course. Again, which is basically how it's happening everywhere else around the world.
Right. And how much would it require? Like how much of a change in posture for the government would it require based on your current analysis of spending, let's say right now, for it to actually have a tangible impact on the degree to which the Bank of Canada has to raise interest rates? So how much would the government have to change?
So if roughly speaking, you could have, say, government expenditures, so government consumption remain basically flat in nominal terms the next couple of years. And that would, probably allow the Bank of Canada to shave about 50 basis points off the total amount of interest rate increases that are required. So it's a meaningful impact, but it's also a meaningful adjustment because you've got to keep in mind in that even though you think it makes sense for government to reduce its consumption, there are pretty significant pressures that require some spending, right? I mean, if you've been traveling, if you've been trying to go to the airports, if you've been trying to get a passport renewed, I mean, there are very important priorities that need to be met. So it's really, we think we get a better inflation outcome. Politically, I'm not sure that's the right thing for them to do, though.
Do you see room, though, in the government's current fiscal position to do that? I acknowledge those pressures you're talking about, and then even new pressures they face to kind of help some Canadians who are really feeling the impact of these higher prices through, for example, tax holidays or tax breaks. Do you see some room in there? Because they've also received criticism for higher levels of spending even coming out of the pandemic.
I mean, there's got to be room. The challenge is part of the challenge is, governments want to help, right? Of course, they're aware that the cost of living is an issue, and that's true at the provincial. Like everybody understands that. They understand the political gain and trying to do something about that to help Canadians out. Like that's a no-brainer. The challenge is, the perhaps the most appealing way to do that is, and what some provinces have done is, why don't we give people some money? Why don't we give them a rebate to make it more affordable, to allow them to have a little bit more income at the end of the day to pay for the things that are more expensive now. In doing that, you're actually making the inflation situation worse. You're helping, but you're making the inflation situation worse to other Canadians. So the challenge is, the best medicine against inflation now is basically you've got to control growth, and you control growth by pulling some money out of the system, whether that's the Bank of Canada doing that or whether that's the government doing it. Both kind of are working in the same direction.
I think there are a lot of Canadians watching and listening to your remarks, listening to the minister's remarks, and who are, like we've said, very worried about how much things are costing, but then in addition, the overall impact and future impact of rising interest rates. Yes, the economy has good employment numbers right now, good growth numbers right now, but there is that ultimate concern that 18 months down the road, we could also be facing a recession. Based on what you're watching on all those spaces right now, what would you put the odds at for a recession 18 months from now?
I mean, it's something like 25%, 1 in 4. But to us, what's perhaps most important there is not so much the probability of recession, but the likely triggers of a recession. In our mind, the most likely trigger of a recession is inability to bring inflation down. Because at the end of the day, if you can't bring inflation down, you've got a further erosion of purchasing power. So it's even more difficult for people to pay their bills, and you've got higher interest rates associated with that. So there is a benefit in trying to act pretty aggressively to control inflation, because in our mind, it reduces the risk down the line to the economy.
Is that the single, just before I let you go, is that the single, greatest tool? I'm not sure if tool is the right word, but I keep hearing politicians say, for example, the president south of the border, it's not inevitable that there is a recession. Is the key to that, though, reining in inflation?
Well, it's absolutely not inevitable. I mean, our base case is there is no recession because we think inflation is going to get under control. But if you don't get it under control, I mean, at the end of the day, the central bank is required to get inflation to 2%, come hell or high water. So there is always the possibility of achieving 2%. The question is, how painful is it going to be to get there?
A question my guess is a number of us are asking ourselves, a number of Canadians. Thank you very much, Mr. Perrault. I appreciate your insights.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.